Oh, started. Oh man. Okay. Hi. Can I check? Can I check audible and visible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. Oh, okay. All right. Very unfortunate I could do PM again, but we try our best. I'll take POIs in chat, please. Preferably from my diagonal, which is yeah, okay, yeah, preferably from my diagonal, but if none from the diagonal, I'll take it from opening as well. Starting in three, two, one. Colonization has created various irreparable harms for the victims of colonization. It has created things as atrocious as mass genocide, labor exploitation, resources and land being forcibly stolen, people being assaulted in ways that I cannot say in this round RLB equity. The harms and the direct harms created to colonial subjects is vast. But more than that, the long-lasting effects of colonization will continue to reverberate today that will continue to affect and diminish society centuries into the future. This looks like the racism and stereotypes created by colonizers to justify their colonization over the indigenous people. This looks like geographic, racial, and economic inequalities entrenched by the colonial masters that won't go away for centuries, that will impact generations and generations of past colonial subjects far after the colonizers have already left. It is for these reasons that we believe in two things. The first is that the actions of the intelligista were complicit and constitute a war crime. But the second is that even if they don't constitute a war crime, these trials and trialing them as war criminals is good for societies anyway. Before I move on to my constructive material, one important caveat. The caveat is that we only have to defend trialing them as war criminals, but not necessarily convicting them as war criminals. This suggests to you that every person that is deemed a possible war criminal will be given a fair trial where evidence is heard, where their own perspectives are heard, and will only be convicted if they actually meet the bar for war criminal. This suggests to you that if they weren't actually guilty, if their actions didn't actually contribute to colonization, if, for example, there were extenuating circumstances that forced them to lecture this way, if a gun was placed towards a head, if for some reason they can prove that they were unaware of the harms of colonization being caused, then we think all of these things will be given a fair weighing within the trial. We think that this means that people who are not actually guilty of these war crimes won't be convicted, and people who have extenuating circumstances will, for example, be given more lenient sentences. So we think like a fair trial can probably still exist. We don't have to defend every single person who is tried being convicted. What therefore is the substantive of this debate? The substantive is why do these criminals deserve to be tried? I'm going to prove this in three tiers. The first is why colonization constitutes war. The second is why colonization specifically constitutes war crime. And the third is why the contributions of the intelligista are culpable within these war crimes. So firstly, on why colonization constitutes war crime. Before that, I see that closing has a POI. I'll take it.
Clarification, generally artists and intellectuals don't meet the existing international standard for a war criminal, so will you be changing the actual standard of what a war criminal is?
Well, yes, I think we can revise the standards of war criminal based on the three tiers I'm going to tell you about why colonization and complicity in colonization constitutes a war crime. Yeah, thanks for clarification. Anyway, so why does colonization constitute a war crime? I think why does colonization constitute war? I think colonization constitutes war precisely because it's basically a form of annexation. When you colonize a country, you rob them of all the sovereignty. You gain control over the people, you gain control over resources, and you gain control over governments, over the ability to govern these resources, to govern these lands, to govern these people. Colonization is basically a fancy term for annexation. So if you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is probably an act of war, you probably should agree that colonization is an act of war as well. The second tier, however, to prove is why colonization constitutes a war crime. We think that colonization constitutes a war crime because the treatment of the colonizers on the colonized is cruel and unusual. Colonial subjects were treated as humans and therefore treated in ways that you will only treat non-human animals, right? They were treated in ways where all their autonomy was dropped away. They were seen as having no brains. They were forced into exploited labor, right? They were treated in ways where the women were assaulted. They were forcibly relocated from their homes with no regard for their cultures, with no regard for their self-determination, with no regard for even their physical and mental well-being. And all of this has been uncompensated, right? I don't think I need to spend a lot of time to tell you why colonial subjects were often treated in cruel and unusual ways by the colonial masters that waged war upon them. Whether we look at Leopold in the Congo, whether we look at the way the Japanese treated the Koreans in the Korean Peninsula when they invaded, and the mass atrocities that were committed, we think that many of these would constitute war crimes, already should constitute war crimes, and therefore we think it's not just war, but also war crimes. But the last tier I need to prove is why the intelligentsia is culpable in these war crimes and therefore should be personally tried as war criminals. The important framing here is that oftentimes the intellectuals within these societies tend to be fairly well heeled, tend to be fairly privileged, tend to be fairly well connected. They usually understand quite well what is happening within the country and understand what are the implications of actions that will be taken upon the country, right? That's why they're considered intellectuals in the first place, because they surely must have an understanding of what is going on and the possible ramifications of their actions. This suggests two very important outcomes. The first outcome is that they are often fully aware of what the colonizing force is doing. They are fully aware of all the harms that the colonial masters have imposed upon the colonial subjects that I just talked about earlier in the speech, and they are fully aware of what is going to happen if colonialism persists and how terrible their countries will get. But the second important outcome is that they are also fully aware of the personal contribution they will make at a point in which they become propaganda masters for these colonial masters, right? They know that our lectures will be crucial in convincing the elite, in convincing the upper class and business leaders to continue their complicity in the exploitation of the people within their lands. They know that the art they produce and the propaganda they write will be crucial in placating the population, or in gaslighting people to be happy with colonialism, in lying outright to people about the actual effects and future effects of colonialism. They know, therefore, that A, why colonization is out of time, why colonization is so harmful, and B, they know personally their contribution towards colonization and why they make it even more harmful. This suggests to you that they're fully culpable in all the war crimes that I explained to you earlier on. What therefore are the two impacts at the point in which we allow these people to be tried as war criminals? Two impacts. The first impact is that it's simply a form of reparations and catharsis for the many people directly harmed by the war crimes committed by colonizers. Right? I think this is an important tenet of justice to give redress to people who have been harmed, to make them feel as if their harm is being recognized, to make them feel as if justice has been served. These people who have been harmed in the past, these people who are harmed right now, and these people who will be harmed a century later when colonization still reverberates throughout the country, these people get some form of redress and catharsis at the point in which the people that were complicit in this are tried. But the second impact is that you create a discourse and you create a narrative that is decolonizing. You force the people, you force the elites to challenge their preconceived notions of the possible harms vis-a-vis benefits of colonization. You force them to introspect about how colonization may have created harms for the country and introspect on how they may have personally created these harms. You create a decolonizing narrative that actually helps countries move on from colonization. For all these reasons, opening guns.
I thank the Prime Minister for the very fine speech. With that, calling upon leader of all. Here.
All right. Am I clearly visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Amazing. I'll just set my timer and then I'll start. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Note that the motion states that not only would these people be tried as war criminals, they would also be punished if they were found to be guilty. Not only does side proposition not give us any degree, any explanation to what the bar of being a war criminal is, given that similarly we persecute rapists, we persecute people who have actually committed, plundered, and actually murdered people in war, and they haven't been able to show why these intellectuals are on the same level of moral degradation as them. But two responses before I move on to framing and our constructors. Firstly, then, they talk about how these people knew and were aware about how the colonial forces were actually killing them. But then again, the people who are in the military and who are in positions of government in colonial states were also aware of how these forces were happening. They were part of the government. So by their logic, every single politician, regardless of whether they're from the country that were being plundered, should be targeted by them and should be persecuted as a war criminal. And I don't think that is something they're going to support. But what they're essentially saying is that these people should be persecuted as a result of crime by omission. So when I see someone hanging from a building ledge, I probably cannot save them because I probably do not have the strength to pick them back up. But I'm still aware of the fact that they might fall off from the building. Given that these people did not have the capacity to actually reverse colonialism, did not have the capacity to actually stop the loot and plunder, because they would happen anyway, because they would probably be replaced if they resisted, like the thousands of other people who are also replaced at a point in time they tried to resist the colonial forces because they were just that much more powerful. But then they talk about how introspection will happen on their side. But that is symmetric, right? So introspection can happen regardless. To discourse pushed by anti-colonial intellectuals who could rise up when the colonial forces actually leave and there isn't a threat to their lives anymore. We tell you that the same intellectuals who actually supported colonial policies because they are forced into it actually supported anti-colonial policies because they were the most aware, because they knew about these things to begin with. Firstly, on framing, realize colonial states structurally target intellectuals because they perceive them as a threat to their increasing amount of power. Why is this the case? Firstly, they perceive these people as the most able to put up resistance. The people who are the most intellectual, people who are the most aware, and they're perceived as more as a threat. Secondly, these people have a cult of personality. Their voice has a presence. They can collectivize a lot of people. Given that that is true, they put a lot of soft pressure on these people through diplomatic ties to going to their own families and telling them that they would be killed if they did not support these policies, right? But thirdly, people trust them a lot in terms of decision making. So if these people were allowed to be rise up against the anti-colonial process and colonial processes, they knew they would be killed. And this then implies that there was massive amounts of pressure from people they know that they would be killed because entire structures of society was controlled by colonial states, right? And there weren't a lot of post-colonial states around at that point. So you didn't really know that if you could ever move out of colonialism, if ever your family would stop being beaten up on the street. So you had no hope. You were in a state of complete desperation and isolation, and you were made to feel so by the colonial powers. But realize the colonial states had a lot of power, massive power militarily. Society was infiltrated and controlled by them. If they were not and the people were already brainwashed, these were being sent to assimilation schools where they were being taught colonial propaganda, not only by these people, but also by white men who they brought over from their own countries. Other intellectuals would already probably exist, and these people would probably be replaced. So brainwashing is something that would also happen. Proposition's burden is then to show why these people uniquely would be able to overturn this brainwashing. But realize what is the implication of these pieces of framing. This proves that most of the intellectuals from those post-colonial states were probably supporting these colonial policies, right? And these policies weren't being framed as, oh, we're going to kill people. These policies were being framed as economic development. So we can also disprove that they could also potentially be brainwashed through fear. And given that the biggest biological incentive human beings have is not to die. And realize, fellows, when people fulfill their biological incentives, that insofar as they don't directly harm anyone, we don't persecute them. If you have sexual urges and you conduct it out in a consensual manner, we don't persecute you. We only persecute you when you directly harm someone, to taking their consent away, to taking their agency away. And these people haven't directly done that, right? And caring for your loved ones, caring for them and trying to provide for them. When you know that if you don't listen to the colonialists, your lives will be taken away because you are perceived as such a big threat, is an obligation that they need to fulfill and is an obligation that is more proximate to them. I don't know why your individual responsibility to yourself, given that you were born alone, given that you were born arbitrarily into a state that is persecuting you, your obligation exists outside you. But realize, fellows, the burden that proposition then needs to prove is that even after these post-colonial states were independent, these people would still support the colonial ways. If we can prove to you that these people would not stand for these colonial ways anymore, they probably should not be persecuted. Why is the reason for this? Firstly, because a lot of people who were okay with colonialism already accepted their fate, right? So there were other people in society who already accepted their fate. And I don't think they, for accepting their fate, should be equally persecuted. But if you supported colonial policies after your state was independent, you would probably be socially alienated because there's a vigorous fervor of nationalism, of their country being able to overturn colonialism. So anti-colonial hate was massive. You'd probably be targeted, harassed, discriminated against. But thirdly, the government, whose entire stance is based on an anti-colonial stance and who have captured a lot of political will to having been seen as the saviors of the country, will persecute you to make themselves seem better, to make themselves seem stronger, and pipe down any anti-colonial, any voice against themselves. So on the comparative, you are very unlikely on our side to support colonial policies after the country became independent through protest, through uniting. But realize, panel, we do not persecute people for not fulfilling obligations in society. Even if it is true that these people had an obligation outside of them, we like to the other people in their society. We don't persecute people for this. We don't persecute people for not donating to charity. We do not persecute people for not going out in protest and risking their own life. We do not persecute mothers and fathers, even though they're responsible to their children, for not being the best parent, because what the objective metric for this is something that cannot be determined. But are constructive then on why these countries required the colonial intellectuals to survive, and that why they would be jailed or targeted and killed by the British or the colonial powers. Firstly, these people could probably assist in infrastructure planning and allow the country to be rebuilt, given that the colonial states uniquely ravaged the country right before they left because they did not want these states to survive. And they would probably kill a lot of these intellectuals as well if they did not support them, if they perceived them as a power that could probably overthrow them. But secondly, these artists and intellectuals are required for social messaging, to unite people, to tell people that, hey, we have been able to overcome the powers of colonialism. Listen to us, we should unite. They are the ones most capable to rise up and instill an idea of nationalism that is required to unite people and required to socially cohesion people and allow the state to regrow. But they're required to break the structures of colonialism down because they uniquely have the most amount of information on colonial structures, given by the same premise that side proposition talks about, how they're aware about colonial practices. They are the most able to reverse colonial laws, to pull back these laws and create policies that are more equitable to society, policies that do not discriminate against Hindus or other minorities in the country. Realize, panel, given our framing on why most of the intellectuals would probably support these colonial policies, if on their side you persecute them, the country does not grow. The country does not have voices to actually give them information on how to grow the country. In a similar way, they're put in prison for decades on their side. In similar ways, we allow technocrats to structure our country, a country that needs to be grown from scratch, the country which does not have a financial sector, which does not have a manufacturing sector, which only has raw materials, needs massive amounts of planning to regrow, the planning that can only come from these intellectuals. And for all of these reasons, they do not meet the bar for a war criminal, and they're essentially required by the post-colonial state to regrow and become a country that can flourish. For all of these reasons, very, very proud to.
Thank you, Leader of Op, for the very fine speech. With that, calling DPM. Here.
Cool. Am I clearly audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, cool. Give me a second. Okay. The path to victory for opening government is extremely simple. The first thing that we are going to prove is that this fits the criteria for a war crime. And if we are able to prove this, then we advance outright because it aligns with the principle of justice and the point in time in which a crime has been committed, we ought to prosecute it through all means necessary. The second thing we will prove is that even if you do not buy this, why we are prior to everything that opening opposition says, because we create the foundation for society and post-colonial recovery to happen in the first place. Before that, one important point of clarification, and that's to push back on the burden push that comes out from opening opposition. The motion only requires us to defend trying, and if they meet the criteria, to be punished as a criminal. It does not mean that these individuals get an automatic conviction. It also means that things like being forced under duress to do certain things are important considerations for the court. It means that these individuals may be acquitted or get reduced sentences. We believe in the process of courts within these societies. The first question I want to ask is, which side best aligns with the principle of justice. And I want to prove three things here. And also note the lack of response. The first is that why we ought to try these individuals in the first place, and note that this is the first win condition for our side of the house. Because if we can prove that the actions that these individuals have committed are on the scale or ought to be considered war crimes, then these individuals deserve to be tried in the first place, independent of punishment. Why does this fit the criteria? Note the lack of response to Boon here. Boon told you how the criteria of war crimes is to drastically alter the lives of non-combatants. It meant atrocities against human dignity. It meant that these individuals were complicit in the plunder of public property, of historical and cultural masterpieces, in the deportation of their own countrymen as slave labor. It meant that they were able to enable things like divide and rule politics that allowed for centuries of segregation and corrupt governmental rule. These individuals were directly culpable for the scale of the crimes, and the gravity and scale of these crimes necessitates alone that we bring these individuals to court in the first place, even if they are found innocent. The second thing I want to explain is the concept of mens rea and mensis reus. The response that we get from opening opposition is to say that these individuals were forced to do these things under duress. I want to note two responses here. The first is that if it is the case that these individuals were forced to do this at gunpoint, or if their family were held at gunpoint, we think that this counts under extenuating circumstances. We're fine with giving these individuals a lighter sentence. But second of all, we would also note that the courts within the status quo already have provisions for things like motive, for example. So if you accidentally kill someone, you're tried under manslaughter, but you're not convicted for murder, for example, even though you're still tried within a criminal court. We think that these things are transferable to war crimes, for example. So if you unintentionally but still created a massive harm upon the world, we can try you for the action even if you were not culpable. But the last thing I want to prove and respond to here is why these individuals naturally were culpable for the vast majority of these situations. The suggestion that we get from opening opposition is to say that these individuals were actively forced and targeted by these individuals, that they were indoctrinated via things like brainwashing. One, this is often not the case because it takes massive amounts of time for things like propaganda and brainwashing to happen. These things it doesn't make sense chronologically, because the resistance and the uprising that individuals on the ground have happens most often when the colonial power is first moving in, which means that it doesn't make sense for these individuals to suddenly have a wealth of experience and brainwashing to target these academics. What we posit to you is more simple, is that these individuals were either coerced, in which case under our side of the house we can make provisions for that, or more often than not, these individuals were bribed. Why is it incredibly more likely that these individuals were bribed? And note that they do not contest the intelligent observation from Boon here, that the majority of these individuals, in fact, were part of the ruling elite, because these were the only individuals that had the privilege of going overseas for studying, for example, the only individuals who were comfortable enough to pursue a life of academia. These were the individuals who were targeted by these colonial masters, and that was important. But last of all, we posit to you that even if this was not the case, it was still an act of academic negligence that they allowed this kind of knowledge to proliferate among individuals on the ground in the first place. What this meant is that these individuals, for example, did not sample properly. They did not account for differing perceptions, for example. And so so even if it was unintentional, they fed common individuals incredibly harmful propaganda, which meant that you dismantled and undercut the ability of ordinary individuals to protest against the colonial master, to attempt things like uprisings that perhaps could have afforded them a modicum of integrity. The conclusion of this argument is that these individuals actively did fit the criteria of being war criminals. And either way, even if they were innocent, we ought to send these individuals to the court in the first place, because the gravity and scale of their crimes necessitates this. I want to position this now. Weigh this on two metrics. First, that this is principally correct and just. Note that the point in time in which we are able to prove that this is something that we ought to do, this is the most prior clash to win within the debate. It doesn't matter if there's backlash, or it doesn't matter if this is bad for the government later on, or it doesn't matter if closing government is able to prove better impacts about post-colonial recovery than us, because because we should only try someone in court if they meet the criteria for getting into that court in the first place, and we prove that, so we win this clash instantly. But second of all, this is the most central clash within the debate, and this is the reason, and therefore this is independent of practical outcomes, and this is why we position this clash well. Closing opposition. 3, 2, 1. Okay, moving on. The second question I want to ask, therefore, is why we are better for the post-colonial recovery. The important clarification that we get from Boon is that the majority of these intellectuals were part of the ruling elite and they were actively supported by their colonial masters. This meant that these were individuals who were able to profit off the exploitation of your own people. They were actively getting a cut from the cultural treasures that were sold and plundered overseas. What this means that in the point in time in which you have post-conflict recovery, we ought to prosecute these individuals in order to prevent massive amounts of political instability. Opening opposition has a preemptive response here. They say that these individuals are good to reverse colonial law. One, I'm unclear as to why this is the case, given that there is massive amounts of distrust of these individuals because they were actively complicit within the colonial elite. But second of all, these were individuals who were part of the ruling elite. This means that these individuals were associated with these colonial masters. They were the very same academics. It's unclear to me why you can't have more new academics or just academics who weren't complicit in these crimes to proliferate these things instead. Rather, we posit to you that it's important for us to try these individuals under the law because the point in time in which you were able to cast off the shackles of colonial rule, you needed to create a unifying narrative that all individuals were equal under the law, there was immunity afforded to no one, that the inequalities of the past and would no longer happen within your new country, and all individuals would be treated equally. The most important thing you needed to prove was therefore to explain that individuals on the ground would all be treated equally, they would all be tried equally under the law. This meant that under outside the house, we were able to wipe the slate clean, and means that individuals were able to bring closure to centuries of colonial rule, and meant that these individuals could move forward as a country. This is prior to all of opening opposition's impacts, because we explain why we lay the foundation for colonial recovery, opening government.
Thank you, DPM, for the fine speech. Now calling DLO. Here.
Cool. Just checking if I'm clearly visible and audible.
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. 2 semantic tricks in opening government. First, they squirreled the motion into oblivion. Panel, if you read the motion clearly, it's tried and punished, not tried and punished if they're deemed as perfectly guilty. This means the motion implies that you are punished if you had the rhetoric of supporting colonialism at that meantime, not the specific nitty-gritty things you did. This means if somebody is taken to court because of supporting colonialism, they will be punished as war criminals according to the implication of the motion. Second semantic trick. This happened at PM and was extended at DPM. Closing correctly asked in a POI, hey guys, these people oftentimes don't fit the criteria to be tried for criminal court. Their response, hey, we're just going to make an adjustable criteria and that they have the framing capability to do so. I find this absurd. In a post-colonial state which has been ravaged by colonialism, they want the criminal justice system to be one that is good enough to create a fair, proper, equitable, and charitable legislation in order to cater to their unique needs at a time when the country is facing immense crisis and perhaps lacks the resources and the individuals needed to create something. Sure, these were very unrealistic characterizations they had. But lastly, they said, hey, if only they fit the unique criteria that they make for this. Who makes the criteria? Are these people capable enough? These are questions they needed to substantially prove. We can just say they're not, because these are post-colonial societies with not proper judiciary systems established yet, and entirety of opening government now gets framed out of this debate. First, what were our claims? We said that these people oftentimes don't have a choice and they would be taken away. There's like, nah, they were bribed, we're completely fine with them at gunpoint. Here's a colonialism example. Bangladesh, which is the country I originate from, used to be under Pakistan until 1972. Do you know the first thing Pakistan did when establishing colonialism? It is to take away the intellectuals in the country. So the first thing a lot of colonialists even do is take away the intellectuals, meaning intellectuals living within the country feel an inherent threat that if they do not support the colonialism, they will be dealt the same card that the previous intellects did. This is a reason that they do it for. Why are they the prime targets? It's because they're studious, people believe in them, they have a cult of personality, education is scarce in these resources. So this was just a prime target of their survival in this case, but it also seems like an uphill battle, which is why they chose this outcome. Because if you look around yourself as an intellect, post-colonial societies were not really a thing. if you're in South Africa, because everything was colonial around, and it was just an uphill battle because their colonials had just a lot more resources in order to fight against you. So it seemed like a really uphill battle. Knowing this, when you pin it up against potentially losing your family, you're much worse off. Bangladesh is currently having a pretty big movement. I'm pretty sure Muhib had told everybody about it. So when people and leaders actively feel threatened by what the government is doing, is it really wrong for them to change their rhetoric because they want their family to survive? We tell you that we're not, but we also induce this with our stance. We told that we're fine with prosecution and punishing them if their rhetoric and views on colonialism doesn't shift after these states. I don't understand why OG didn't have the framing capacity to do so. Here's why they'll change. Two reasons. One, there is a new government which actively has an agenda against these people and would not keep people who support the previous times. But two, the Stockholm syndrome isn't like there in politics. So you know why I support colonialism? Because they tortured my kind. Like, I'm sorry, but that doesn't happen. Oftentimes these people are sympathetic. They oftentimes just don't have anything to do in this case. Why would they have not been exclusive on their side of the world? All they have to prove that on their side of the world, in case they're prosecuted, or like if these people weren't there, there wouldn't have been the harms that were introduced. Here is why they would have. Crackdowns would have gotten a lot worse in case these people had the rhetoric against colonialism. This is because they would have seen this as a form of resistance by the people, thereby be extra violent in these areas. This means when these people didn't talk up, violence would have gotten even worse. Second, they would have brought in scholars from the colonial states to teach them what the British are doing to the Indians and the Pakistanis. They're really good, and these are educated people, thus would have been convincing. Three, sellout politicians would have existed in any ways with a cult of personality who the people would have believed, who would have brainwashed the politicians anyways. It is much better to not vote for them in these cases because oftentimes they're not exclusive. Before I move on, I would like to take closing for like their extension. Three,
So, yeah,
yeah.
cool. So this wasn't a coerced decision. Oftentimes, intellectuals justify colonialism because they are aware about the benefits of it, or they are aware about the end outcome of it, and they justify it by saying that it's like something that's beneficial for society. It's not a coercive decision, as you say.
Okay, so that's the thing. See, it's a post-colonial state, right? If they still, after colonialism is over, support colonialism and say that those were the golden days, those were the glory days, we want to go back to that, we're fine with prosecuting them because that's seen as anti-nationalistic. What I'm saying is that a large majority of intellectuals during post-colonial states did not speak up against colonialism because they were scared. But in case they support colonialism, once the colonials are gone and they continue supporting the regime they had back then, we're fine with prosecuting them in their case. Now, on to our substantive. We told you that this is the only ways for these pillared societies to develop. Panel, education in post-colonial states is a scarce resource because there aren't enough institutions and infrastructure in place to educate people. Education is scarce. These are the only intellects in the country who can actually work to restructure and rebuild the country which the colonials have left them with. On their side of the world, they prosecute them and make the country be in grim despair as there is no near signs of hope. On our side of the world, we make the best use of these people because these people work with politicians, with the normal people to know what development of roads and highways and infrastructure should be there. It is not just about making equitable policies which do not allow these rhetoric, which government squirreled us into. It is about how these roads and highways initiatives should be, where the rail lines should be put in. This means that there is a lot more nuance in actually how these countries are now reshaped into development. They said, why can you not have new academics? And that's just asserted that, oh, you just cannot. Here is why you can't. One, academics take time to create because education is a lengthy process. Two, education is expensive and not a lot of people can afford it. Three, educational institutions in these places simply structurally don't exist because they were ravaged and taken away by the colonialists. Given that colonialism has an active incentive to make sure that the people aren't aware of what's happening to them. In these cases, these are the only people who can hope reshore the country and take the country to a time where they're not underdeveloped, where they're not in ruins. Panels so that these countries can develop. It is crucial we make the best use of them. I am so proud.
Thank you, Diego, for the very fine speech. Now calling member of government to extend their case.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can see you.
All right, thanks. I'll take POS in chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A quick point of preamble. Why would the conviction be likely to happen and must take place now? Two things. One, the context of a post-colonial state is likely still very fresh and immediately post-suffering and post-atrocities. So this means there's a huge sense of detest and abhorring of these colonial elements and knowledge and sentiments. Secondly, this also means that convictions under our side will receive significant buy-in, but also that there's a time sensitivity that's involved in this. So if you do not do this at the very soonest, you likely allow for more such discourse with regards to affirmation of colonial history to linger and persist over time, and therefore impede the process of nation building. That's the frame in which CG will win this debate. I want to first respond to opening opposition on two fronts. First, they say that intellectuals who forwarded these colonial policies are likely the ones that can reverse these colonial structures. I think it's blatantly untrue. Just because you're more privy to these kinds of knowledge and you produce these knowledge doesn't mean that you would directly use that knowledge in favor of that post-colonial state and sort of have a complete reversing of your mindset entirely. And secondly, it's not as if we don't get access to those kinds of knowledge flow under our side. Presumably under our side, we have folks who are hugely opposed to colonial history, who are aware and have personally experienced the most horrible implications of colonial history and are better positioned to speak out against all of these horrible structures compared to if you were previously producing knowledge with regards to affirming colonial history. The kinds of controversy that you generate as a result just becomes a lot more divisive as a result. I have two extensions in CG. Firstly, why would the persecution as war criminals be effective in unifying and sort of proceeding to nation building? Secondly, how do states engage with this knowledge on opposition side moving forward if we did not persecute them? First extension on the effectiveness of this prosecution. I want to note that this is the prerequisite to achieve OG's overarching benefit of post-colonial recovery. I want to first ask, how do people use the knowledge to justify horrible things within opposition side? We say that post-colonial states tend to want to unify, but some folks within the country may still want to lean into benefits such as, the British have brought forth a good system and foundation upon which we can build our country upon. Why is this form of apologist approach detrimental? Two things. One, that these were the kinds of knowledge that embolden detrimental ways in which colonizers have run the state, exactly what OG said. But more importantly, B, colonial knowledge actively detracts from efforts and countervailing knowledge streams to break that state free from the shackles of colonial history moving forward. So on our side, when you prosecute these intellectuals as war criminals, what happens? Two main things. One, you set a standard and metric that disavows these kinds of colonial affirming knowledge. Two, you incur a huge stream of countervailing knowledge that comes in to prop up things like self-sufficiency, independence, etc., etc. So what kinds of these knowledge am I referring to? We say things like anti-colonial rhetoric, postmodernist views with regards to society, knowledge and views that are centered around national and identity building as a result. Note that all of these kinds of intellectuals, like say Francis Fanon under our side, that are in question, would these kinds of intellectuals that introduce these anti-colonial knowledge would have been otherwise buried or hidden if we had not actively established this stance of going hardline against all of these colonial affirming knowledge. Why is this kind of knowledge far better in unifying people and overcoming atrocities of colonialism? Two things. One, colonial knowledge is largely divisive at that point in time, especially in a state where scars are fresh and sentiments are largely unstable. We say these kinds of colonial affirming knowledge likely opens up these kinds of wounds and subject that country to more destabilization down the line. Secondly, anti-colonial knowledge is more unifying. You can rally the most amounts of people to collectively partake in state apparatuses and processes to rebuild that state. The last-ditch effort from opening opposition under this is to suggest that certain people have benefited from colonial structures and therefore we ought not prosecute these intellectuals in question. We say in CG, we're still able to rally these people to be under our side because the framing of the state in forwarding these discussions is still to prioritize the state and ensure that it is able to move forward meaningfully as a result. This means that demonization of these people who benefited are unlikely to happen and that they're still able to opt in. I want to note that we're prosecuting these intellectuals, not the people on the ground who benefited as a result. Obviously, governments can still lean into propaganda in a way that suggests that they were perhaps subjugated or brainwashed and do it in a way that doesn't demonize or antagonize them such that they're not willing to partake as a result. The conclusion, therefore, is that it is under our side that you get new streams of anti-colonial knowledge that would have been subjugated that are incredibly important for us to move towards nation building in the future. Before I go on to second extension, I want to take Oh. 1, 2, 3.
You still cannot prove that you do have the framing capability to show that these trials are going to be fair and good, given these judiciaries are not properly established. You don't have fiat in this debate.
Our material is not contingent upon those like punishments panning out. Like the process of you engaging in a trial and prosecution is enough to establish that stance, which brings about all of the outcomes we talked about in terms of knowledge stream. So it's not contingent. Our second extension on how do states engage with this knowledge moving forward if we did not prosecute them. I want to note that this is building upon what OO said in terms of these intellectuals being like cult of personalities and using it against them. Because if it's true that these are cults of personalities, they will likely still have huge influence in terms of propagating these ideals in a stage where you need to prioritize nation building. The premise of our extension is that opening these states up to Western sentiments, you make them more vulnerable to neo-colonialism and Western imposition in the future because you embolden this inferiority complex. This is important because, like, you know, a world where post-colonial states don't establish a staunch stance against these forms of knowledge means that it is easier for these Western states to come back in and extract resources to the detriment of these post-colonial states. So things like the Western states being able to say, we can offer you the best forms of developmental opportunities, or post-colonial states themselves feeling like they have to like depend on Western countries and they cannot be self-sufficient. These are horrible in terms of moving that country forward towards nation building. What ends up happening is that even if the best case of opposition, these post-colonial states break free from like the structures, they don't truly break free from the remnants, and they'll forever be tied towards the same groups of people that subjugated them in the first place. What changes under our side? Three things. One, you establish a clear stance of like post-colonial states that like colonial history is something that is categorically bad and we should reject entirely. Two, we instill a sense of self-sufficiency and a strong sense of identity among these post-colonial states that they do not need colonial dependency just to develop. We also see this also very important in the process of like developing the country and nation building. Most crucially, given that countries are unlikely to be totally independent, we say under our side, we empower these like post-colonial states to actively seek leverage and bargaining chips in their interactions in the future. So you don't see yourself as being inferior or chess pieces of these ex-colonizers. You are far more willing to push for leverages and equalize the kinds of interactions that take place on a global stage as a result. This is important because we're the only team that points to you the initial points of nation building as well as how things get better in the long run. It is because of all of these things, CG.
I thank member of Curve for the very fine speech. Now calling member of Op. Here.
Can I verify that everyone can hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Wonderful. POIs in the chat, please. I will hopefully take opening around 5. If opening doesn't have anything, I will take closing. Is anybody not ready? Cool. On CO, we do not care whether these people have criminal trials. However, we oppose trying them for war crimes specifically. This does two things for the round. One, this immediately outframes both gov teams, as neither of them provide a reason why this needs to be war crimes in particular. Try them for sedition or something. I don't know why it has to be war crimes, and OG never tries to tell you, and it's too late in whip for closing. Second, way more specific to the motion than OO, because we want to tell you why the exact crime they're being tried for is bad, not why trials are nebulously bad. Now, look. Our case is that war is not what it used to be. It used to be that half of populations would just die and leaders would tactically massacre civilians to help them win wars and get political power. This has stopped. Even though there are bad wars now, they're nothing like what they used to be. This is because of the Geneva Convention and banning things like war crimes. But in order for the Geneva Convention to work and keep wars substantially more ethical than they used to be, it is crucial that countries can wage war legally, even if those wars are otherwise unjust and don't have a real casus belli or we don't like them. By diluting the definition of war crimes to mere thought crimes, this undermines the legality of any war, resulting in more violent and destructive wars. So, what are war crimes? They are a set of specific crimes internationally recognized by every country unanimously in the Geneva Convention. These include 3 main categories. 1, deliberately targeting civilians as civilians. Notably, this does not include incidentally targeting them. So, for example, if you're shooting at soldiers and hit a civilian, that's not a war crime, but if you shoot a civilian because they are, that is. Second, cruel treatment of combatants. This looks like, say, torturing prisoners of war using chemical weapons. And third, deliberately destroying infrastructure where civilians need, like, for example, hospitals or places where you keep food. Yes, war is always bad, but stopping war crimes makes it enormously less bad because now civilians aren't starving and half of your country didn't just die. Note, this is a specific and direct form of violence. Countries can disagree about a lot about how you ought to engage in war, but they all can agree that you should not shoot civilians knowing they're civilians. You should not starve civilians knowing they're civilians. No one is that evil. Even though we can disagree about so many things, no one in their right mind will ever disagree about this. As a result, because this is enforced successfully, wars no longer kill 40% of the population of a region. They might kill, say, 5%. It's still bad, but most of them were soldiers or at least near soldiers, and they're at least relatively safe in places like refugee camp. Well, at least even if they're hungry, they aren't starving. I really want to underscore, as recently as the 1920s, war was not like that. Even the most brutal wars, like the Congolese Civil War, was not that like that, precisely because the Geneva Convention works. It is imperfect, but it works. Why does the Geneva Convention work well right now? It deters leadership. Specifically, leaders have assurance that they will be punished if and only if they commit these direct, specific crimes, and the punishment will occur even if they win the war. What does this look like? This looks like, for example, the threat of the extradition if they ever step out of their country. It looks like international actions, like sanctions, like UN intervention with armed forces. This means that even if they win, they might be fighting more. They can never leave their country. Their country would go to shit and there'd be a rebellion. This all means that even if they win, this is not enough to stop them from being punished. And it is guaranteed and is contingent on specific crimes. Note that otherwise, leaders have incentive to use war crimes tactically. Massacring your enemy's population is good for you because it makes your enemy weaker, because now they're wasting their resources taking care of the sick, and they have less taxes, less food, less other stuff. So you as a Machiavellian leader, and especially in civil wars, the most Machiavellian people tend to rise to the top by killing their enemies. This means you often have people in charge who are really willing to do these things if you don't specifically deter it. But really importantly, stopping these things is premised on unity because they require collective actions. These trials are going to break down the Geneva Convention, stopping deterrence. Two reasons they do this. First, they cause factionalization. Oji literally said they would change the definition. I'm not sure how they think they're going to do this, because international treaties require unanimity, and most Western countries like things like freedom of speech and the ones who did colonialism, so they obviously will never approve. This means you have a subset of countries who are massively reinterpreting what a war crime is, while other countries oppose it, and just going ahead with it anyways, and having trials and using the word. Obviously, this causes factionalization, between countries who oppose this and ones that don't. And second, more importantly, it muddies the waters. You create a precedent for expansion for political reasons. You enable trying thought crimes. You expand trials of civilians, whereas before it can only ever apply to a soldier. You no longer require direct accountability, i.e., you no longer have to have ordered an attack or been the one to do an attack, which is quite important. This means that a bunch of shit is now triable as war crime, where it is not triable before. Now, importantly, this breaks down the Geneva Convention even if every single person is acquitted. This causes three main problems. I'll explain them in a second, but before I do that, I'll take opening.
As you correctly point out, war is changing and the bad things you can do in war are changing. Is it not then a good thing to reconsider how we constitute war crimes?
No, when you reconsider them, you change it the wrong way. Not all change is good. This is our entire case, right? So, when you change this, you cause three main problems. First, you mean there's no bright line for a war crime anymore. Leaders are no longer sure that punishment is contingent on specific direct action. They think there's precedent for political things being tried as thought crimes. Like, well, okay, I was on the wrong side of the war if I lose, so I'll be tried. They think that, well, I published an ideological piece, that's why I'm a leader, I'll be tried for that. They think, well, maybe I'm not a general, I'm, a political leader, but civilians have been tried. Suddenly, it looks like you'll almost definitely be tried, especially if you lose. So there's two bad things. One was a slippery slope, because now we're debating whether a bunch of things are war crimes, and it's no longer obvious and objective, so suddenly calling something a war crime is no longer a slam dunk. You say it's a war crime? Well, I say it's not, and now there maybe is a genuine debate about this, which there never should be, because we have to have unity. And second, it means leaders are more likely to start doing capital war crimes, because they're like, look, persecution is inevitable, interventions are inevitable, I might as well at least win. Second, because of collective action problems. It means that even if this doesn't go to shit, people don't agree on when to intervene. And it means they might never intervene, or when they do, it gets bungled and leaves the worst intervention. People aren't on the same page. This is precisely what happened in Rwanda, because all the Westerners were like, oh no, we don't need to intervene. They waited too long because no one could agree. This is especially bad because some who are doing this tend to be a post-colonial country who usually the ones setting the peacekeeping forces. To the point these people are, for example, way more hawkish than the Western countries. Now you have a bunch of issues when no one's agreeing, and now you can't get the resources, you can't get the food, you can't get the guns, you have a bungle intervention, we killed more people and made it worse. And third, war crimes won't be taken seriously. Countries don't want to be in a treaty which makes wars illegal, especially when they think to defend themselves. This means they'll lead preemptively to signal to other countries they're willing to engage in war. This means that countries that are in the worst state all leave the Geneva Convention and all say, well, now we don't care, so they do war crimes. Horrible. Vote up.
Thank you, Member of OP, for the fine speech calling government whip. Hear, hear.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'll take POIs in chat. If my voice gets too raspy, can tell me. I will stop my speech. Okay. Cool. Let's start in 3, 2, 1. Let's nuance this. OG is only 50% correct when they say that colonization is in theory and in practice bad. The problem here is that in the process of colonization, parties react differently, i.e. parts of the Indian high caste or Malaysian Chinese being beneficiaries of British colonization. This bypasses OG's analysis because even when colonization is in theory an act of war, the subjects under colonization don't always see it that way. I agree with OG that local intellectuals are fully aware about colonial atrocities. This does not meet the bar of culpability as they say, because they view the end outcome, i.e. colonial, economic and political models to be a good thing. So they don't really prove as to whether or not this standard changes in a good or bad way. They just say that this standard changes for the better for some reason. This means that the presumption of the process of colonization being bad from OG is true, but it's not nuanced enough to the end outcome of colonization, which some may argue are on net beneficial. In fact, if colonization was already viewed to be so universally atrocious and frowned upon, this OG team doesn't explain the need to really punish them legally. These academics or intellectuals are likely shunned and pushed to the fringes of society anyway when nobody would have listened to them. This means this debate must operate where this knowledge has some degree of influence over the ways in which states operate with other states, but also in ways in which society interacts internally as well. That's where this knowledge probably is the most harmful that Ernest talks about. Let's talk about the OO case. OO says that quite briefly that intellectuals are brainwashed. This is a ludicrous claim for a few reasons. The first is that there are intellectuals with access to a myriad of information. They reach the conclusion that colonization is a good thing, not because they are brainwashed, but because they genuinely believe it was a good thing. This doesn't mean the vibe check, because intellectuals probably are the ones with the most exposure to academic readings and academic resources. This was a conscious decision to justify colonization. The last response bypassed OG's war crime standards and the principle of justice, because in the aftermath of post-colonization, courts and legal institutions are still developing. So things like the independence of the judiciary or due process or via text or impartiality exist as concepts but aren't fully implemented in courts. So it's unsure why courts can operate in ways that are in tandem with the principle of justice. So maybe they are forced to confess under duress. Maybe they are framed by the state. Maybe they are presumed guilty before innocent. This does not matter, because justice in post-colonial states are speculative because of the developing nature and the unclear nature of legal institutions within this area. What is more concrete is that we limit the spread of this knowledge because of the harm that this knowledge has, which Ernest thoroughly outlines in the apologia that this knowledge espouses that hinders the nation building process. The last is that just use your eyes, read the motion. Local intellectual in post-colonial society. The timeline where you acquired that knowledge doesn't matter. If you acquired it during colonization or post-colonization, it doesn't matter. We are trying them anyways. OO wants to skirt away and say that if they acquire this knowledge post-colonization, then we try them. That's obviously our burden also. Let's talk about nation building. This OO says local intellectuals are crucial for development. Untrue. First, there are remnants of colonial laws. This team doesn't explain why they would work together with politicians to repeal colonial law. The presumption here is that these are local intellectuals that view these laws to be good for development. So there's more incentive for them to maintain colonial laws because they spend so much time and effort defending these laws in their writing. Second, oftentimes we do agree that you get some degree of development under OO. The problem is that development doesn't trickle down. It usually are in urban centers with the wealthiest majority rates, because these are the main beneficiaries of colonization. Third is that unnecessary extension explain why there are other parties that are capable of nation building. The prevalence of anti-colonial and post-modernist knowledge means we at least rethink the ways in which we develop, to not rely on Western trade and to strengthen economic ties with other regional partners as well. So you don't over-rely or you don't over-depend on only your colonial partners as the means of trading. The last is that this is crucial, but this bypass the unclear nature of courts that opening wants to argue. All says courts are unfair and unjust. All this says no, courts are fair and just. The beauty of this extension was that this doesn't matter. Courts can be unjust as hell, but insofar as we prove that we limit this knowledge, even in unjust courts, it still is the net benefit for the stability and the nation building of this society. Let's bring CO into this discussion and this weird war example. The first is that this is an insane extension, because this debate wasn't about war with other countries. This debate and war crimes and what constitutes as war crime and the ways in which you try them are internal processes in which we do these things. So, for example, we try Nazi war criminals in the the Nuremberg trials, for example, or in the Tokyo trials. So it doesn't really talk about the ways in which states wage wars against each other. Because sometimes nations like the US, nations like a lot of European nations, for example, don't abide by the Geneva Convention. Look at Israel, for example, that did not abide by it when it comes to the genocide of Palestinians within these areas. Oftentimes, the nature of war does not change. It is already bad now. They don't prove as to how it's likely going to get worse under their side of the house. The second is that the nature of war changes very drastically. That's the extension. But the linkage to prove why it will change the very nature of the Geneva Convention doesn't really stand, because they don't prove as to why this is about external war with external countries or external states. There's like an internal process within post-colonial society so this discussion doesn't matter. Lastly, is this slippery slope argument where states criminalizes ideas. The surprising thing is that even in Western states, this has happened. We criminalize Holocaust denial. We criminalize eugenics and race science. We criminalize and outlaw Nazis and communist symbols. In fact, we do these things. They don't prove as to why we don't do it and why we ought not to do it right now. Because Western states that value freedom of speech also do it before that opening.
Instead of strawmanning us into oblivion, saying that we will brainwash intellectuals when we said brainwash the population, and just taking away every single valid thing we say, how about you truly engage with our claims? It seems like a pretty valid strategy.
Yeah, so your claim was just also ridiculous, because your claim was that it helps in the nation building process. Insofar as we prove that it doesn't help in the nation building process, we win. And this is where Ernest's extension was very important, because we prove that there are tangible harm that this knowledge brings and how post-colonial states interact with the colonial partner. The inferiority complex means that you need to constantly over-rely or over-depend on Western partners in order for you to trade, in order for you to get aid, for example, which means that we see them as being savior complexes. So what happens then is that, sure, you get development, but that development is always tied towards Western actors that do not have your best incentives in mind. This means that under your side of the house, the type of development that you get is not sustainable, because it's still coming from one source of actor. You don't know how to develop yourself economically. But secondly, the reasons why war crimes are the biggest and the best way to try them is because it provides the highest amount of deterrence. This CEO says, why can't we try them via sedition? If we do so via any of the alternative like sedition or hate speech or whatever, it still incurs the very same harm that CEO wants to talk about when it comes to criminalizing thought as well. So that alternative that they want is also something that negates all the impacts about the outcome of war. So then for all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the government whip. With that, I call upon opposition whip to conclude the debate.
Okay, I'll take PYs in the chat. Closing opposition's argument is very simple. This debate is not about whether these intellectuals and these artists are criminals. It is about whether they are war criminals, and whether post-colonialist states have the right to utilize our international processes to try these individuals. When you introduce arbitrary and disagreeable actions to the level of being a war crime, that is when you destroy the sagacity of our systems, or prevent the worst of the worst actions from occurring, because that is when people start disagreeing. Closing government says that these are internal trials. That is not true. A war crime is a very specific, internationally defined word. The Nuremberg trials were special because they were the beginning of essentially defining what a war crime was. They were special because they had international participation and non-partial juries, like people who were not involved in either side of the war, because we actually tried these individuals on an international stand rather than trying them by the country that won the war, that actually won the war. The very fact that this is disagreeable, that we are able to debate this motion at all, whether these individuals have that we are able to debate this motion at all, is the reason why Gov causes international backlash and dissent. The unwillingness to sit on the ICC, the unwillingness to extradite or to hold criminals, the unwillingness to contribute to victim funds are all the impacts of possible people dissenting from these functions. Closing government then says that we already try intellectual crimes. That is true, and closing opposition is perfectly fine with that. But we do not try intellectual crimes as war crimes. It is not a war crime to deny the Holocaust, but it may be a crime in some countries. In fact, they say that you're going to create more deterrence by raising this to the level of a war crime. I actually think this is probably false, because war crimes actually end up being tried for significantly longer than actual crimes because they must go through international systems. This means you actually probably have less deterrence because the individuals know that they will not be punished for a very long period of time. Let's weigh as to why unity is probably the most important impact of this debate. One, because mass buy-in allows the trying of actual war criminals. Because any country that chooses to no longer participate, even if it is only one, is another place where a war criminal can go to hide without extradition. This means that actual war criminals, people who have actually killed people in ways that are unjustified, will not be tried and justice will not be had. Secondly, a bright line creates certainty. When you can change the definition of what a war crime is at will, then no one will follow the existing law. When simply espousing your views can make you into an international criminal, you have no reason not to go to the worst of the worst actions. The result is more actual war criminals get created, more violent war criminals get created, and they then cannot be tried because they can simply run away to a country that is not participating. The question you have to ask yourself at the end is it worse punishing a bunch of artists and intellectuals at the risk of ending the lives of actual innocents in the preclusion of justice? Let's talk about closing government first. Closing government says that engaging in the prosecution of colonialists is good because it creates unity and prevents neo-colonialist thought. One, I think this is much more powerfully done by prosecuting actual criminals, actual violent criminals like military leaders. Note that closing government causes division because you prosecute natives, i.e. these are the intellectuals and the artists that you can actually access because they are within your country. Now you probably have issues where people in your country think that the people in their own community are fundamentally against themselves, which you don't actually create the unity that you talk about. What you create is division, and division where you worry about your neighbors possibly being against you. Secondly, this causes more divide because war crimes are uniquely international. For example, I really don't think that the United States or Europe will stand against this violent violation of freedom of speech. This blatant violation of freedom of speech. Now what happens is your international trials are paused, and your criminals can run to an embassy in Australia or something, and you fundamentally create chaos. The problem with this is that when you bring a disagreeable trial to the ICC, what happens is these individuals get platforms. For the past decade, every time we brought a criminal to the ICC who wasn't immediately prosecuted, what happens is it's like a huge Twitter storm, and then everyone will talk about these neo-colonialist thoughts, and what happens then is that people actually get exposed to these ideas that closing government doesn't like very much. Let's talk about opening opposition next. Opening opposition argues that intellectuals are not war criminals because they were coerced into their actions. This does not take opening government at their strongest, i.e. there probably are some intellectuals out there who are fully culpable for their actions. Closing opposition, however, proves that even those who are fully aware of their actions and consented to these actions are not war criminals and should not be tried as such. Secondly, opening opposition does not engage with the counterfactual. A state that is willing to prosecute intellectuals as war criminals is unlikely to utilize their ability to build infrastructure. That would be ridiculous. The best case for government then is probably that these people get prosecuted as criminals anyways. Closing opposition proves that this is simply a better counterfactual, which means that opening opposition doesn't reach their impact because these people probably get thrown in jail in either world. Let's weigh this argument. Their impact is that you keep intellectuals around to use in growing your nation. One, this is not unique. You can simply make more intellectuals or invite immigrant intellectuals into your country. Secondly, this is not proven and it is not certain. No, these are not even the same intellectuals. We're talking about artists versus people who actually build infrastructure are engineers, which means this argument makes no sense. But thirdly, on the scale of impact, opening opposition proves development is slower in their best case. But we on closing opposition prove that there's irreparable violent actions and genocides which may occur if you violate the sanctity of war criminal law. Take that, POI.
War trials have always been highly politicized, and definitions have constantly evolved as more war crimes emerge. Why is this the tipping point for these trials to become
Because this is
lose
absolutely
legitimacy? And by
ridiculous. It is a blatant violation of freedom of speech where you try people for saying and posting things on the internet. This means that the Western countries, and basically any country, will never agree to it. This is the point in which you have the breakdown at the ICC. That is fundamentally an incredibly bad thing. Opening government makes 4 claims. 1, colonization is very bad, so it is a war crime. 2, intellectuals are culpable for these crimes because of their status as intellectuals. And 3, this is good for victims. And 4, this stops future colonization. All 4 of these claims are poorly mechanized and are all false. First, the act of colonization is not a war crime. Some of the bad things that they do may be war crimes, but this is important to note because what is and is not a war crime is clearly written into law. Simply engaging in war is not enough to make you into a war criminal. But note that opening government's policy would necessitate an expansion of what a war crime is. This means prosecuting people for actions that they took that they did not know were a war crime and that they never could have known because it wasn't a war crime at the time. Opening government's justice is arbitrary. It gives power to the government to randomly prosecute intellectuals and create witch hunts. Secondly, the intellectuals may be aware of the harms of colonization, but it does not matter because awareness does not necessitate a crime. They are exercising their freedom of speech. Note that they are not advocating for violence. They are only advocating for the acceptance of things that have already happened. This is very important that we do not establish international precedents against freedom of speech. Third, they say this helps victims. That is not true. Retribution is not the standard of justice. In fact, retribution often makes people angrier because it normalizes anger and violence. The result is that victims are never made whole, but rather these resources are spent on harming others. An eye for an eye means the whole world ends up blind.
I thank the opposition whip for the very fine speech. With that, we can conclude this debate. Thank you, teams, for a wonderful debate. You can all leave this room for the judges may deliberate now.
Good debate, guys.
Okay, it ended. So we're just waiting for the deliberation.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.